Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it one more minute for everyone to join, and then we'll get started. We still have people joining.
Okay.
Lorraine, it looks like it's slowed down a little bit.
Okay. I'd like to call the June 23rd, 2025 PDASC meeting to order at 2:02 p.m. Christina, can you please call the roll?
Yes, thank you. Pallavi Aurora.
So have your computer. I'm here.
Thank you. Renee Bovell. Renee Bovell.
They might.
Okay. Sean Brown. Sean Brown. Angela Bryant. Angela Bryant. Allison Siborowski. Allison Siborowski. Lorraine Diana.
Present.
Thank you. John Elliott.
Present.
Thank you. John Gambrell. John Gambrell. Candace Hall.
Here.
Thank you. Sharita Golden. Sharita Golden. Jim Gutman.
Present.
Thank you. I'm gonna go back. Allison Siborowski, I believe I just saw you join. Is that correct?
Correct. I'm here.
Thank you. I went back. Darren Johnson. Darren Johnson. Greta Kessler. Greta Kessler. Barry Lipsy. Barry Lipsy. I see you, Mr. Lipsy.
Yeah, here, I'm sorry, it was on me.
Oh, thank you. Kathleen Logran.
Yes, good afternoon.
Thank you. Eric Morse. Eric Morse. Mark Nicole.
Here.
Thank you. Sean O'Brien.
Present.
Thank you. Mandy Poplowski. Mandy Poplowski. Amy Prentice.
Present.
Thank you. Kimberly Robinson. Kimberly Robinson. Glenn Schneider.
I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Kelly Schultz.
I'm present.
Thank you. Danita Tolson.
Present.
Thank you. Sean Tunis. Sean Tunis. Joanne.
I'm here. Good afternoon.
Okay, thank you. We have quorum.
Hi, this is Kimberly Robinson. I joined after you got into my name, so I just want to let you know that I was here.
Oh, thank you so much.
Same here.
Appreciate
This
that.
is Sean Brown. I also joined after you took attendance. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Christine, and good afternoon, everyone. We need to move on to a motion to approve the April 28th, 2025 meeting minutes. Has everyone had an opportunity to look at the minutes? And if so, can I have a motion to approve the meetings as drafted?
So moved, O'Brien.
Thank you. And a second?
Second, Jim Gutman.
Thank you. Any discussion? All approved, say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. I hear
Um,
no nays, so the minutes are approved as drafted. Thank you.
Mr. Lipsy, did you raise your hand?
I did, yes. That was just a vote.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Recording in progress.
Um, Lo-
Mark, are
Lorraine,
you
can we move on
available
to-
to talk? Okay, yep, I'll move on. So we're going to talk about an opportunity for public comment. Christina, did we receive any public comments?
So the PDASC received one written comment, and that was shared with the PDASC members, and it was also posted to the website. We may have one person that is here for oral public comment, but I'm not sure I saw them join. So let me find out if they're here. Is there Dr. Harry G. Wanter? Are you here? Dr. Harry G. Wanter? Lorraine, I believe there's no public comment today.
Okay, thank you, Christina. So now we will continue our learning series and discussion. We have two topics we will be covering today. The first is a federal government drug pricing update from the portal team. And the second is a biotech and life sciences update in Maryland from Kelly Schultz, the CEO of the Maryland Tech Council. I am going to turn it over to Andrew to introduce the portal team.
Great. Thanks, Chair Diana. So similar to the last stakeholder council meeting, we're excited to take this opportunity to allow for the stakeholder council to gather information on broader issues and topics related to drug access and affordability. So folks will remember that in our last meeting, we had an extremely in-depth overview of the prescription drug pricing system and supply chain. And I think that's going to be a resource that we will continue to reference and use over time. So if you have not had the chance to review that presentation, please go back. Similarly, these presentations will be recorded and available on the website, and we hope that they will be a reference and a resource for the different topics that are covered today. So today we're looking forward to getting an update on federal policies and issues related to drug pricing and affordability. And then also a presentation on the state of the Maryland biotech sector and potential policies to help Maryland promote a strong biotech sector. For the first presentation, the federal policy in this space is constantly evolving, as folks may know, and if you're following any of the headlines, this is definitely a moving target. But we do think that this is at a good point to get an update on some of the key issues. So to present this information, I'd like to introduce Matthew Martin, a program coordinator for the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law portal at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where he leads the group's consulting work and the state prescription drug work with the state prescription drug affordability boards, and supports other portal policy engagements at the federal and state level. He also manages the team's internal operations and research dissemination strategy, and his research focuses on the relationships between prescription drug affordability and market incentives for innovation. And he will be joined by Dr. Benjamin Rome, who's a general internist and health policy researcher at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member in the Division of Pharmacology and Pharmacoeconomics in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And within the division, Dr. Roan works within the program, the Portal Team program on regulation, therapeutics, and law, where he studies how federal and state policies influence the regulations, use, and cost of prescription drugs with the resulting effects on patient access, affordability, and clinical outcomes. In 2022, he was selected as an Emerging Leaders in Health and Medicine Scholar by the National Academy of Medicine. So as you can tell, we have an outstanding set of experts that are going to introduce us to some of the key issues on federal policy. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Matthew and Ben.
Great, thank you, Andy, and great to be with you all today. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. Again, I'm Matt Martin, Program Coordinator with Portal. I'm with my colleague, Dr. Ben Rome, and today we're going to sort of give a high-level overview, as Andy alluded to, of some of the more recent developments in the prescription drug space going on at the federal level. Next slide. So just, I think Portal has presented to this group. Can we go back one more quickly? Great. So I think this group we've spoken to the Portal team, or the Portal team has spoken with this group before, but just as a quick introduction, we are an interdisciplinary group at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School that broadly focuses on the intersection between evidence-based use, regulation, and affordability of prescription drugs. Our group does not receive any funding from pharmaceutical companies or medical device companies. We do receive research funding from the sources on the next slide.
Sorry, Matt, my computer was trying to update.
Oh, no worries at all.
Not a great time. Slide 2, correct?
Yes, great.
Okay.
Yeah, so
okay. And then are you okay taking questions throughout, or did you want to do it at the end? I just wanted to.
I think we've set aside time for questions at the end, but there are sort of some natural breaks along the way. If people have sort of pressing questions, we can tackle.
Okay. Thank you. I'll let you proceed.
Great. Thanks. So next slide. So just to give you an overview of where we're headed, so I'm going to sort of briefly talk about at a high level, sort of the congressional and executive branch sort of actions that we'll be discussing today, and then we'll sort of break things down by broad policy areas, as you see listed on this slide. We could dedicate a presentation to each of these topics in their own right, and so the sort of overview we're going to give today is really just that, an overview of sort of where these different policy priorities are and sort of what the potential implications may be for drug pricing at the federal level. And then we'll wrap things up and leave time for Q&A at the end. Next slide. So on the executive branch side of things, most of what we're going to be discussing today relates to 4 executive actions or executive orders that the Trump administration has issued since taking office in January. So there were 4, one in February that was focused on provisions related to healthcare price transparency, which does include some prescription drug provisions, a broader executive order in April that has a slew of provisions related to drug pricing. That also was paired with another order on domestic drug manufacturing. And then the most recent one that's probably gotten the most headlines has been this executive order related to implementing most favored nation pricing in the US. We're going to focus mainly on the second and fourth executive orders throughout this presentation, but happy to answer questions about the other 2 as well. Next slide. And then we're also going to be sort of focusing on the congressional side of things with the bill that is currently making its way through Congress, so the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That does include, at least on the House version of the bill, some prescription drug provisions. So the House, this is the Congress's sort of annual budget reconciliation bill that they can pass. The package passed the House back in May. The Senate is currently working on their version. And July 4th has kind of been set as the tentative deadline that congressional Republicans would like to have the bill passed. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on the provisions as they're drafted in the House version of the bill. We do have Senate text now for their version of the bill, and I will highlight sort of where there are significant changes on the drug pricing provisions between the two versions, but we'll sort of mainly still be focusing on the House version. Next slide. Okay, so to kick things off, we're going to start with the recent announcement of the Trump administration's effort to implement most favored nation drug pricing. Next slide. So broadly speaking, the executive order that sort of initiated this whole process outlines actions that federal agencies are supposed to take to align U.S. drug prices with prices that are paid in other developed nations, or what is sort of known as most favored nation pricing. And there's sort of three sections of this executive order that sort of outline ways that the Trump administration views this MFN pricing being implemented. So the first is section of the executive order related to addressing what they call freeloading on U.S. innovation. So directing the Commerce Department and the U.S. Trade Representative to take any actions against countries that are engaged in, quote, unreasonable or discriminatory practices that may, broadly speaking, artificially deflate the prices paid for drugs in those countries and forcing American patients to sort of pay a disproportionate amount for global pharmaceutical R&D. As a result of this, in response to this, the Trade Representative recently issued a request for information that tries to get input on both sort of what policies or practices might fall into this sort of very broad sort of bucket of potentially disruptive practices, as well as sort of countries that the administration may want to look into to sort of remedy any concerns on this front. This is an avenue that's not been sort of pursued in prior administrations in terms of addressing sort of the lower prices that other countries pay, but sort of we're waiting to sort of see where the details go on this provision. The second part of the executive order focuses on direct-to-consumer sales of drugs at this sort of most favored nation price. So it directs federal agencies, mainly HHS, to sort of facilitate these kinds of direct-to-consumer purchasing programs and platforms for the manufacturers who make their drugs available at most favored nation prices. It's unclear sort of whether this would be a government sort of led and run program, or it would be sort of an expansion of some of the existing direct-to-consumer platforms we've started to see emerge, run by manufacturers, so like Lilly Direct or NovoCare, for example. And in sort of the language that the Trump administration has used around this effort has suggested this direct-to-consumer model is kind of sort of how they see the main sort of mechanism to implement most favored nation pricing. But we're sort of still waiting for details in terms of how exactly that would play out. Next slide. And then the sort of bulk of the executive order that actually touches on how exactly HHS and other relevant agencies would determine this most favored nation price. It's very broad, and I think there's still a lot of details left to be explained, but broadly speaking, HHS was directed to sort of communicate these most favored nation price targets to manufacturers within 30 days of the order, to bring drug prices in line with comparably developed nations. HHS has subsequently released a press release that indicated that this MFN target price for all of these drugs would be considered the lowest price in an OECD country that has a per capita GDP at least 60% of the US's per capita GDP. We have not sort of seen drug-specific targets beyond this, and sort of reporting around implementation of the MFP suggested that this sort of very broad characterization of a target price as, the price of a OECD country with at least 60% of US GDP is being the target price, but it's unclear sort of how that would play out for individual drugs and how the sort of negotiations and discussions between manufacturers and HHS are going as it relates to this provision. In the event that the manufacturers and HHS are unable to come to some sort of agreement and make, quote, significant progress towards implementing a most favored nation price, there's then a sort of slate of policy options that agencies can pursue and enforcement actions that agencies can pursue to sort of more or less sort of force implementation of the most favored nation pricing. So this sort of can be range from sort of initiating rulemaking, which mirrors sort of what the previous Trump administration tried to do in terms of implementing MFN prices, efforts to facilitate importation, address sort of more trade leaning aspects related to sort of the export of pharmaceuticals in the country, leveraging the FDA's authority to sort of modify or revoke approvals for drugs, and sort of any other actions that these agencies deem necessary to sort of implement most favored nation pricing. Next slide. And so while this executive order and the sort of language that has come out since the issuing of the executive order does represent a revival of a policy that was introduced in the first Trump administration, where they tried to implement most favored nation prices for drugs covered under Medicare Part B, there are a few notable differences between that attempt and this current effort. So one being the sort of generally broader scope, in that the MFN prices that are being targeted and pointed out here may apply to a broader selection of drugs beyond those in Part B, and also may apply to a sort of broader segment of the market more broadly. So thinking about sort of the commercial market, for example. There's more agencies involved this time around. So they're not only directing sort of HHS and CMS as the sort of usual suspects to sort of implement this kind of policy, but also leaning more on sort of trade policy agencies and actions to implement MFN prices. This is best reflected in sort of shortly after the executive order, the Customs and Border Protection issued a warning to manufacturers about accurately reporting the value of their imported or exported products, or they could face sort of penalties for trade evasion, which kind of signals the different approach the administration is taking to try to get at most favored nation prices. At the same time, though, this policy is designed on its face to sort of be a voluntary first model, so trying to negotiate with manufacturers to voluntarily implement MFN pricing, and then if sort of those negotiations are unsuccessful, to then sort of move towards more enforcement actions to try to compel manufacturers to enforce these prices. And then, as I mentioned previously, a broader focus on this direct-to-consumer model and facilitating patient access to most favored nation prices through a sort of direct-to-consumer mechanism, which may have implications for patients who are using these platforms, because most favored nation prices, if it follows the trend of sort of other direct-to-consumer platforms, these sort of lower prices may only be available for patients who don't use insurance. And so if someone is trying to use their insurance to obtain a drug at an MFN price, that may have implications for the success of or the savings that could be potentially available to patients. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the revival of this policy sort of mirrors one that was taken in the previous Trump administration. It's also sort of prompted introduction of legislation trying to implement most favored nation pricing or some sort of international reference pricing approach. None of these bills have moved forward, but it's just of note to see that there seems to be some congressional interest in a bipartisan manner around this issue. And while there may be sort of savings potential of implementing MFN pricing, both for sort of patients in the system writ large, there's likely to be a lot of operational and legal challenges to trying to implement most favored nation pricing at scale, which can ultimately sort of limit any kind of savings that are accrued. So for example, the countries that the US would reference in order to set these MF prices does matter. And depending on sort of how that process plays out, it may incentivize reference countries to keep their negotiated prices confidential, which makes it harder for the US to reference them. Prices may not be available for every single drug in every single country, particularly if the drug is only approved in the US and not available in other countries. And then more broadly speaking, without having some sort of complementary price negotiation or health technology assessment process, which many other countries use that do use this kind of reference pricing, most favored nation approach, and sort of as a component of, but not the sole sort of tool in order to address prescription drug affordability. Without those kinds of other tools, these kinds of pricing activities may make US prices for drugs more sensitive to those other pricing dynamics in other countries, which could have unintended consequences that are hard to sort of predict, sort of when the initial price is set, so to speak. Next slide. Okay, so that sort of wraps up a sort of summary of the most favored nation pricing efforts, I'm now going to sort of pivot to a different part of the supply chain and talk about some of the pharmacy benefit manager PBM reforms going on in Congress. Next slide. So in the House version of this budget reconciliation bill, so this One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there are a few provisions that relate to sort of the business practices of and reimbursement and payment of pharmacy benefit managers, specifically in Medicaid and Medicare. So talking first about PBM reform efforts in Medicaid, there's a section of this bill that does a number of things in terms of how PBMs are paid by plans and how they sort of pass through payments to pharmacies. So this section would prohibit spread pricing in Medicaid. So this is a case in which the PBM charges the state Medicaid program more than it pays the pharmacy for a given drug and then keeps the spread. 25 states as of 2023 already ban spread pricing in their MCO contracts. So the sort of broader implications of this whole-scale ban are slightly unclear. This section also would limit the payments that PBMs give to pharmacies to the ingredient cost, which is typically the National Average Drug Acquisition Cost, or NADAC, plus a dispensing fee. And that dispensing fee cannot be less than what state Medicaid fee-for-service programs do. This particular provision may have the impact of basically equalizing the payment pharmacies receive from fee-for-service Medicaid and Medicaid MCOs. Setting it sort of at this NADAC plus a dispensing fee structure. The same section also limits the payment for PBMs, so what the sort of plans pay them for their services, to an administrative fee that's sort of based on a fair market value of the services they provide. And then there's also transparency provisions in this part of the bill that would require PBMs to submit data to state Medicaid programs and to HHS upon request that detail all of the costs, payments, and fees that sort of move through the PBM for covered drugs under these programs. Next slide. On the Medicare side of things, the House bill, but notably not the Senate version of the bill, also includes reforms to PBMs in Medicare Part D. So in this House section, payments to PBMs by Part D plans would be limited to a bona fide service fee, which cannot be sort of tied to the drug's price or rebate agreement that they may have with the manufacturer. It also requires that any manufacturer rebates or discounts that the PBM sort of negotiates be passed through to the Part D plan sponsor. 99% of Part D rebates are already passed through to plans based on a GAO report from a few years ago. So again, the sort of broader implications and cost savings of this particular section are somewhat unclear. And then the biggest chunk of this particular section focuses on requiring PBMs to annually submit reports to HHS and to their Part D plan sponsors with a sort of host of data about basically the PBM's operations and the drugs that are moving through and the costs that are moving through the PBM on behalf of the plan, as well as trying to get a little bit more transparency into sort of potential implications of vertical integration between PBMs and pharmacies, other sort of contracts that PBMs may have with manufacturers, as well as justifications for why a PBM may place a branded drug over its generic counterpart on a Part D formulary. Next slide. Sort of tied to these PBM provisions in the sort of congressional budget reconciliation bill are changes to pharmacy reimbursement in Medicaid. So next slide. So another section of the House bill and the Senate text of the bill as it's currently drafted would basically change how the NADAC survey, so the National Average Drug Acquisition Cost Survey, is conducted. So it would require that all retail community pharmacies and any sort of applicable non-retail pharmacies, so this includes specialty pharmacies, mail order pharmacies, any of these kinds of pharmacies that accept Medicaid are sort of now required to participate in the NADAC survey or else be subject to sort of penalties. This is notable because most Medicaid programs use NADAC or some sort of similar measure plus a dispensing fee as a basis for pharmacy reimbursement. However, the NADAC survey is currently voluntary for retail pharmacies, and specialty and mail order pharmacies are not even sort of surveyed. And so the reported acquisition costs of how sort of the cost that pharmacies are paying for their drugs currently as represented in the NADAC may not be as representative of the actual acquisition costs these pharmacies face. And so CBO has estimated that this provision and this change to NADAC would save about $2.4 billion through 2034, presumably because by sort of having a more accurate or more representative NADAC survey or NADAC sample, the actual value of NADAC itself would go down, which would ultimately translate into lower Medicaid reimbursement to pharmacies. Next slide. So that sort of touches on some of the PBM and sort of pharmacy side of things. I'm now also going to sort of give a high-level overview of what's going on in the Medicare drug price negotiation program. Next slide. So there's sort of three tracks of the Medicare negotiation program that are kind of going on simultaneously right now. This sort of program has, from as far as everyone can tell, continues to move forward as it was sort of statutorily designed in the Inflation Reduction Act. So for the 2026 maximum fair price, so these are the prices that CMS negotiates with manufacturers and will sort of be the maximum price that Medicare beneficiaries can pay for a particular negotiated drug. So in 2026, which was the cycle of negotiations that wrapped up last year, and the implementation is sort of set to take effect in January 2026, CMS has initiated the pharmacy and manufacturer enrollment period for this Medicare transaction facilitator, which is the entity that CMS has sort of crafted to both facilitate data exchange between pharmacies and manufacturers to verify that a particular patient is eligible to receive the MFP and to address sort of duplicate discount concerns. And then also to exchange the sort of chargeback payment that the pharmacies will receive from the manufacturer to sort of bring whatever sort of reimbursement level in line with the MFP. The 2027 cycle of negotiations are currently underway. So that list of drugs was announced earlier last year, I believe, or earlier this year. Negotiations are ongoing, and CMS presumably submitted its initial sort of price offers to manufacturers as of June 1, and then manufacturers have until July 1 to accept that offer or propose a counter offer. And then the 2028 cycle of negotiations, CMS has released draft guidance for these negotiations, which address sort of new components of the program, including the inclusion of Part B drugs, so predominantly clinician-administered drugs, how the agency plans to handle renegotiation of maximum fair prices, and also sort of touches on the broader implementation of those prices for all three of these negotiation cycles. I'll also note that the Trump administration in an executive order did specifically comment on this 2028 cycle of negotiations and has emphasized that CMS should, in this guidance, should seek to improve the transparency of the negotiation program, prioritizing high-cost drugs to Medicare in the program in terms of selecting drugs for negotiation, and also working to try to minimize any potential innovation impacts of the maximum fair prices. It's not clear sort of what kinds of sort of policy decisions the administration has in mind to sort of get at these three goals, but it is the sort of first we've seen of the Trump administration's priorities when it comes to the negotiation program. Next slide. Sort of happening in tandem with the negotiation program as it currently stands are two congressional bills, one of which was included in the House version of the budget reconciliation bill that would change how the Medicare drug price negotiation program operates. So in the House version of the reconciliation bill, there's what's known as the Orphan Cures Act, which generally speaking would modify the current orphan drug exemption in price negotiations. So under the current sort of framework, drugs that have a single rare indication So, sole orphan drugs are exempt from negotiation. This bill would change that provision such that drugs that have a single rare indication or multiple rare disease indications or multi-orphan drugs would also be exempt from negotiation. Similarly, current policy says that there's a 7 or 11-year waiting period, depending on whether you're a small molecule or biologic drug, 7 to 11-year sort of waiting period before a drug is eligible for negotiation after FDA approval. And that approval, that sort of clock starts ticking at the time of the drug's first approved indication. This bill would also sort of change that provision and specify that the clock for the 7 to 11-year waiting period doesn't start until a drug is approved for its first non-rare indication. So if a drug is first approved for a rare disease, the sort of time period for it to start being eligible for negotiation would not be until it got its first non-rare indication. So the CBO has estimated that these changes would increase federal spending by $4.8 billion through 2034. And also given the fact that year over year, the number of new drugs that are approved for rare disease indications has substantially increased. Ultimately, this kind of change could potentially decrease the number of drugs that are eligible for negotiation or delay the time until certain drugs are available for negotiation, which obviously has implications for the sort of savings of the negotiation program writ large. Next slide. The other sort of change that's been circulating through Congress and has been endorsed by the Trump administration through an executive order is what's known as the EPIC Act. This bill would address the what's sort of colloquially called the pill penalty or biologics bonus in price negotiation. So currently, small molecule drugs that qualify for negotiation are only eligible 7 years after FDA approval, whereas biologics are eligible 11 years post-approval. When you add the sort of 2 years to negotiate and implement the MFP, this is how you get to the 9 versus 13 sort of comparison that's often circulated. This bill would sort of change that and basically equalize small molecule and biologics and make them both eligible for negotiation at 11 years post FDA approval. There's been some analysis of the implications of this change were it to make it through Congress. Estimates have suggested that about more than half of the drugs that were selected for negotiation in 26 and 27 would not have qualified under this during those cycles under this change. The CBO has reportedly estimated that this cost would be about $10 billion over the decade, while others have suggested a savings of up to or a reduction in the ultimate savings of Medicare drug price negotiation of up to $36 billion between 26 and 2030 with this change. And while there is sort of evidence to suggest that biologics do not warrant differential treatment from small molecules, folks in our team at Portal have done some work on this. Shifting all drugs to 11 years would ultimately mean that maximum fair prices are in effect for a shorter period of time for small molecule drugs before generic competition, which ultimately sort of may reduce the savings that the MFPs are intended to achieve. Next slide. And then I now just want to sort of briefly touch on some other sort of policies in the Medicaid and Medicare programs that have been floated by the Trump administration in the recent months. Next slide. So the sort of second executive order that I mentioned in that initial slide did provide some instructions to HHS to provide the president with guidance on how to address a variety of other issues related to prescription drugs and pharmaceuticals in Medicaid. So this includes sort of ensuring manufacturers are paying accurate rebates under the Medicaid drug rebate program, promoting innovation in Medicaid drug payment methods and models, better aligning Medicaid payments with the drug's value, and also sort of broadly speaking, supporting states in managing drug spending. So while some of these sort of provisions have been pursued in the past through specific regulatory reforms in the previous Trump administration, so they implemented or tried to advance value-based purchasing agreements in Medicaid for prescription drugs, also issued rules that tended to sort of remedy misclassification of certain drugs under the Medicaid drug rebate program. There also seems to be an interest in some of the existing Medicaid prescription drug payment models that are out there, expanding on them, including the cell and gene therapy access model, which is currently, I think, just recently started up, which would focus on sort of addressing payments for sickle cell disease therapies. But the sort of beyond the sort of language of this executive order, it's unclear what the sort of specific policy provisions of the administration is interested in pursuing as it relates to Medicaid drug spending and drug payment. Next slide. And then on the Medicare side, the same executive order also directs HHS to develop a rulemaking plan that, broadly speaking, improves Medicare's ability to obtain a, quote, better value for drugs that are covered under the program, specifically calling out drugs that may otherwise not be eligible for price negotiation. I'll note that there were sort of 3 prescription drug payment models tested or initiated under the Biden administration, including the cell and gene therapy model I just mentioned. 2 of those 3, so a $2 generic drug list for Medicare beneficiaries and sort of adjusting the accelerated clinical evidence model, which would have sort of adjusted payment for drugs based for drugs with accelerated approval. Both of those sort of models were halted really before they even began at the beginning of the Trump administration. Though the CMMI has sort of since announced its strategy for 2025, and it does sort of explicitly call out an interest in or a focus on sort of getting better, better spending and outcomes for prescription drugs. But we don't sort of know yet what those kinds of models may look like. The same executive order also directs HHS to make sure that Medicare payment does not disproportionately encourage the use of hospital outpatient departments over lower cost provider offices when it comes to administering clinician administered drugs. So this is kind of site neutral payment for Part B drugs, which kind of mirrors efforts in Congress around site neutral payment more broadly outside of the prescription drug space. And the Trump administration has also seek to more information on how the administration can sort of stabilize Part D premiums, Medicare Part D premiums, which builds on sort of similar actions that the Biden administration took to stabilize premiums as the sort of out-of-pocket cost caps and other sort of provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act took effect at the beginning of this year. Next slide. And now we're going to touch on some of the developments in the 340B program and sort of what's going on that space. Next slide. So the Trump administration did specifically outline 2 areas related to the 340B program in an executive order. The first of which directs HHS to survey hospitals to determine their hospital acquisition costs for covered drugs and Medicare, and then based on those findings, potentially propose adjustments to better align Medicare payment with those costs. This is seen as a sort of direct response to the previous Trump administration's effort to reduce Medicare payment for 340B hospitals in particular. That effort was ultimately blocked by the Supreme Court in 2022, in part because they had not done this sort of survey process of acquisition costs. So we can sort of see this as a precursor to similar efforts there. There's also a provision of this executive order that directs HHS to condition any subsequent grants to federally qualified health centers on these 340B entities, sort of making insulin and injectable epinephrine available to low-income individuals at or below the 340B acquisition price. So this also sort of mirrors a previous rule that was finalized in 2020 by the first Trump administration. The rule was subsequently withdrawn by the Biden administration, citing the sort of unclear impact of the rule and also the sort of quote, excessive administrative burden that it would place on federally qualified health centers. I will note too that this provision only applies to that one particular type of 340B covered entity and wouldn't apply across the board. And then sort of along with these executive actions, there's also sort of this waiting period for 340B covered entities and drug manufacturers about further guidance from HHS on the use of rebate models to sort of provide 340B discounts. So having it be a retroactive system rather than an upfront discount. sort of awaiting sort of formal guidance there, as litigation around this question also is kind of ongoing. Next slide. And then I think to wrap things up, we'll then sort of touch on what's going on the regulatory side of things when it comes to drug approvals and actions taken by the FDA. Next slide. So the Trump administration has also, through a couple of those executive orders, begun to outline the priorities it sees for drug regulation from the FDA. So one of these sort of buckets of ongoing work relates to drug importation. So the administration has directed FDA to sort of streamline and improve the Section 804 importation program, and the process through which states can submit to FDA proposals to establish these kinds of drug importation programs. And the agency has sort of proposed offering the states sort of more opportunities to informally meet with the FDA and get feedback on their sort of proposals before they formally submit it. Though so far, Florida still is the only state that has obtained approval for its importation program. But being able to sort of secure drug supply to import drugs from Canada or other countries from manufacturers still is a key challenge, regardless of whether or not the FDA is providing or giving approval of the importation program itself. There's a separate executive order that designed to sort of improve and streamline the ability of FDA and the EPA to streamline sort of regulations and guidance related to domestic drug manufacturing. The idea being that by sort of reducing any sort of duplicative regulations, for example, you could get drug manufacturing sites in the US online faster. The FDA has also been directed to sort of increase fees and inspections, increase fees for and inspections of foreign drug manufacturing sites. And the agency has already shifted towards a surprise inspection model for these foreign drug manufacturing sites, as opposed to sort of alerting them in advance that the inspection is happening. And these sorts of policy shifts indicate a broader interest in, streamlining and prioritizing agency review of these domestic drug manufacturing sites, which sort of aligns with the administration's sort of trade priorities. Next slide. And then the third and sort of final bucket here relates to accelerating drug approvals, sort of writ large. So in the executive order, FDA has been directed to issue a report with recommendations on how to accelerate the approval of a variety of different types of drugs, so including generics, biosimilars, combination products, second-in-class branded drugs. Those are sort of drugs that are explicitly called out in the executive order, as well as provide recommendations on how the agency can improve the process of reclassifying drugs as over-the-counter products to make them more easily available without a prescription. The agency has also sort of outlined broader priorities to accelerate the drug review timelines. So most recently, we've seen this in the announcement of the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher, which would be a pilot program that would issue these vouchers to manufacturers that, quote, align with US national priorities. And in exchange for that, using that voucher, a manufacturer, in theory, could have their drug reviewed in 1 to 2 months, which would be significantly less time than even the sort of current 6-month priority review framework. Unclear how the sort of feasible that would be and what the broader implications of that program would be, including how manufacturers would be selected to receive a voucher. But generally speaking, with all of these kinds of efforts around drug approvals, it's unclear how the sort of recent staff reductions at FDA and sort of retirements of sort of senior officials there may have implications on how feasible these efforts to improve drug review timelines actually are. It's also important to note that the expedited approval of a drug doesn't mean that that drug is going to be affordable or accessible to patients. And then I think it would be sort of important to also note that while there is this sort of seeming interest in accelerating the approval of drugs, vaccines do not seem to be the sort of getting the same treatment. And the reported changes to the clinical trial requirements for new vaccines suggest that there may be sort of more time and more scrutiny of those products. this combined with the sort of CDC's recent, reconstitution of their ACIP committee, which has implications for vaccine reimbursement, makes the sort of regulation and reimbursement of that sort of set of products very uncertain relative to some of these other FDA regulated products. Next slide. And so to wrap things up here, just a high-level summary of where things stand. So the Trump administration, since taking office, has announced a lot of sort of policies across a sort of wide range of areas of the pharmaceutical supply chain that are aimed at broadly sort of addressing issues in the affordability, manufacturing, and regulation of prescription drugs. Congress has also taken an interest in these kinds of reforms and reforming aspects of the pharmaceutical supply chain and sort of a general reimbursement system for these products. But we're only sort of about 6 months or so in, and many of these policy proposals, as I've tried to kind of document here, lack a lot of detail to really assess what the feasibility of these policies are, and potentially more importantly, sort of what the impact may be of implementing these kinds of policies on the sort of healthcare system writ large and on patients more specifically. And so I think I will leave it there and open it up for questions and conversation. And Ben, if you want to chime in with anything, please do so.
I'll just say, I mean, Matt, it's a great summary and happy to take questions. And there's obviously a lot of information that Matt has pulled together in this, and just there's a lot of disparate pieces, some of which are, tangible policies. We can sort of easily see what they're going to do, and some are much more sort of vague policy priorities set in executive order that there's a lot more uncertainty around.
Great, thanks. And Matt and Ben, thank you so much. This was an incredible amount of information that you've put together. So thanks for going through all of that. I would just note that there was one question in the chat from Allison Sarowski asking who's currently in the NADAC survey. Ben, did you want to answer that?
Yeah,
or I know you put
did I answer? I think voluntary.
Yeah, you did.
It's voluntary now, and the idea would be it becomes mandatory, or essentially mandatory, with penalties for not completing the survey.
Yeah, and there's a working hypothesis that it's a self-selecting group of people that voluntarily submit their acquisition costs, which might drive the price up if you're missing key constituents there. So, next, I think Mr. Bryan, I think I saw you first. So, Sean, do you want to?
Yep, sure. Thank you.
We're both named Sean.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, Sean
O'Brien.
O'Brien. That was my bad. I also didn't articulate the last name. Sorry about that. Go ahead. Sean O'Brien, please.
Thank you. I wonder if you can say anything about tariffs, because obviously that's going to affect the price of prescription drugs and sort of what the current state of play is. I know there are some things that are excluded. Some things like ingredients may not be excluded from the Trump, import taxes. And then also we have, I think, some threatened import taxes on drugs going forward. But I wonder if you could talk about the state of play on that a bit. Thanks.
Yeah, so my understanding on the tariff issue is that any of the sort of tariffs that are in place currently, pharmaceuticals broadly are exempt from those, though the administration has sort of indicated that they're very much still sort of considering implementing tariffs on or imposing tariffs on pharmaceuticals. I guess about a month or two ago, there was the Department of Commerce initiated what's called a Section 232 investigation, which sort of is a mechanism that department has to assess sort of trade issues that are of national security concerns. That broadly is seen as that investigation is kind of seen as a precursor to any potential tariffs. As far as I know, that investigation is still ongoing. The sort of public comment period has closed on that port. And since then, I have not seen any sort of significant updates in terms of how exactly they would plan to implement the tariff-related issue. Though you're right, as you pointed out, it would depend a lot on sort of at what point in the supply chain would the tariff be applicable, if we're talking about finished drug products or if we're talking about sort of the, active pharmaceutical ingredients that may sort of be sort of sourced from outside of the US, and where that finished product is created may also have implications for sort of whether or not it's subject to a tariff. So it's still a bit of a question mark. That's kind of one of the bigger issues that's lingering out there that I think a lot of stakeholders would love to have more insight into, but it's still sort of unclear at this point.
Thank you.
Right. And then Sean Brown, and again, sorry for the confusion.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Matt, for that great review of everything, because it encourages me that I'm like, okay, I have uncovered what is there, and there's, you mentioned the lack of details, which is good, because I mean, I am lacking some details here. My question is, for most favored nation drug pricing policy, I feel like there's too many loopholes. I mean, you've probably seen it discussed, like say it's a brand company, they can just send a confidential rebate to the country and then use a list price to sustain the price in the US, and how difficult it is really to get to a net price. And in addition to that, there's legal and other implementation challenges, like you're comparing apples to oranges when you're comparing a free market to a single purchaser market. And just want to know if you agree, or for you to reflect on what I'm saying, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'd say I sort of broadly agree with that, the sort of framing you have there. I think one of the bigger concerns about operationally is that the feasibility of which the US could actually sort of get access to the sort of real net price that sort of payers in these other countries are paying for their products, and that it may incentivize, in countries where that information is publicly available or easily available, it may incentivize those countries to sort of modify their reimbursement system such that it sort of makes things confidential through a rebate, in which case the US would be referencing, like you said, sort of list prices that may be sort of inflated relative to the actual price paid in that country. And yeah, I think certainly the sort of legal issues related to sort of how the prices could be referenced and sort of theoretically sort of imported into the US system,
I
I
think
also raises a lot of concerns.
to build on that too, I think the logistics and sort of like mechanism in which the MFP or MFN, the most favored nation, would be sort of implemented are totally unclear, right? It's not clear, who has access to these most favored nation prices. There's mention of this direct to consumer pathway, but does that mean that the manufacturers just have to make it available? But if you want to use insurance, you still pay the same same old prices in the US, and it's only if you want to pay the full price cash that you have access. So none of it is very clear. But I will say, like, this push by the Trump administration is accompanied by now a suite of bills, some of which have bipartisan support around this topic. And, Democrats have latched on to international reference pricing. So there definitely seems to be some interest in something international reference pricing, and sort of whether anything actually gets implemented and to what extent is unknown. But I totally agree. It's all very gameable. And certainly not, if you're designing sort of rational policy, the sort of like, we'll just take the prices that they have, is not a great rational policy, because it's not very targeted, and doesn't sort of address any externalities, and anyway, there's just a lot of issues with the policy as a whole. But I think that, like, the first issues are just like implementation here, like what does this even mean, and we don't really know.
Great. And then Sean O'Brien, did you have a clarifying question?
Yeah,
okay, perfect.
Another question, if that's okay.
Yep, go ahead, and then Jim got in after that.
Yeah. So also on the topic of the most favored nation EO, at least on the surface, it seems to me there's a bit of a I don't know, conflict or contradiction in it, because it starts out by saying we're going to go after those countries that are the freeloaders, right? Which suggests that they're not paying enough, right? In terms of, right, they're not paying enough in prices to help support drug development. But then on the other hand, it seems to be saying, but hey, we want those prices. I mean, have you sort of seen anything that tries to sort of sort that out? Am I reading that, right? That there's a bit of some inherent conflict?
I think there's a lot of contradiction. I think there's a lot of contradictions in the policy. I also think it just fundamentally is based on, it's it's based on some sort of misunderstanding that there's like some global pot of money that's supposed to fund innovation, and that's, should be divided up equally. That's obviously not how things work, right? Each country is negotiating, its own prices for products, in a specific context. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There's tons of inconsistencies in both the policy itself, but also in the motivation for the policy. So it is. I don't think anyone, who's sort of savvy in drug pricing thinks it's the best way to do it. Would it achieve lower prices in the U.S.? It would. As through a very, through kind of brute force, it would achieve very, much lower prices in the United States, which I think, for anyone who thinks prices in the U.S. are too high, that's one way to get to an end. But it's just sort of, I think, Sean, to your point, like I think it depends on sort of what the framing is. And certainly it's not clear, what mechanism the Trump administration could use to raise prices in other countries, right? That doesn't seem to be there's no sort of legal or policy mechanism I can think of that would allow them to do that, right? So if the UK and Germany and any other countries negotiating prices, right, the Trump administration, any action the Trump administration takes on US prices is separate from those negotiations. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't know. I don't have any good, sort of overarching explanations. I think there's been a lot written about sort of international reference pricing and the problems with that approach. So.
Then Sean Brown, and I think I saw Jim Gutman's hand too, but it's down now. So Sean Brown, if you want to go.
Yeah, quick question on the pill penalty, so-called pill penalty. It's my opinion that can't really be fixed without statutory change. Is there something you see that an agency could do to correct the so-called pill penalty?
I think the years are spelled out in statute. I think it would be
Yeah.
very, very challenging for CMS to sort of change the years in guidance to make biologics and small molecules equal in terms of the number of years prior to being eligible for selection. It's kind of throughout the whole. Yeah. So the policy that Matt was talking about was a policy that had been in the that had been proposed by sort of folks in Congress to be included in the reconciliation bill, but it was not in either of the House or the Senate versions. So we never got a CBO score on how much that would cost. Formally, maybe members of Congress saw such a score, but we never did.
Ben, could the agency use enforcement discretion and thereby kind of achieve the goal of what solving the pill penalty would be? Or
you
what are
mean
your thoughts?
sort of not
just
look at drugs for the sort of 7 to 9
right.
years?
We elect to have enforcement discretion for two or 3 more years.
I don't think so. It's the statute's quite clear on selection for price negotiation. There's not a lot of choice. Like there's no real choice by CMS in there. There's some minor, sort of interpretations of, some broad policies on how to aggregate drugs and things like that. But other than that, I think the statute's quite clear. I mean, the Congress was very prescriptive on which drugs to select. There's a lot of leniency on negotiation itself, but there's very limited on selection.
Thank you.
So
Great, thanks for the question. So we want to be sensitive to time. This was all we had for this section of the agenda, so we'll move on to the next speaker. However, if folks have questions, feel free to continue to write them into the chat. I'm not sure if Dr. Rome or Matt will be on the call after the next speaker is done, but I think we can also maybe open it up if you guys are still there. I did have a question for you guys in terms of likelihood of a policy being passed, of like what's on the table. Do you have any policies that you really support or think is really good policy, or any sleeper policies that we should be tracking? But again, we're going to move to the next agenda item if you wanted to think about that over time. Great, go ahead.
Andy, I just wanted to mention there is one more question about the NADAC in the chat.
I'll respond to that in the chat. So
thank you.
Okay,
and thank you
great.
for your presentation.
Yes,
Matt and
huge
Dr.
thanks to
Rome.
Ben.
It was wonderful. Much appreciated.
I agree with Christina. Thank you so much. Great. So we are going to move on to the next presentation. So we're excited for an update on the Maryland biotech sector and potential policy ideas and recommendations on how the state can support a robust and growing biotech sector in the region. As folks may have heard over the course of this year, the administration very much supports developing and supporting a robust biotech sector in Maryland. We believe that supporting the biotech sector is an important element of providing access to innovative therapies. So with that, I'm excited to introduce Kelly Schultz, the CEO of the Maryland Tech Council. Kelly Schultz is a mother, wife, successful business owner, and has served 7 years in Governor Hogan's administration as the Secretary of Labor and Secretary of Commerce. And again, she currently serves as the CEO of the Maryland Tech Council. In her most recent role in public service, she was the Secretary of Commerce, where she oversaw the state's primary economic development agency responsible for attracting new businesses, job growth, and workforce development. And under Kelly's leadership, the department also served as the largest resource to provide financial assistance to struggling Maryland companies adversely impacted by COVID-19. Prior to entering her career in public service, Kelly was also always focused on her community. And while raising her boys, Kelly put herself through college and worked as a server, bartender, in the evenings and on weekends, and always made time to serve the PTA and volunteer with Brendan and Bradley's sports teams. So with that, again, thank you to Ms. Kelly Schultz for her presentation today.
I should have given you the very abbreviated version of the bio. Sorry about that. What is not updated in there is I am now the grandmother of 2 and 1 on the way. So I will be volunteering on grandchildren's sports teams coming up in the near future. Anyway, I'm so excited to be here, and I promise that I'm going to try to make this quick because I really loved the previous presentation. It went through all of the federal policies, and I see that as an economic development opportunity for us to understand where we are with our competition globally, because we all know that this is a global competition when we talk about our companies that are here doing research, development, manufacturing, distribution, and the benefits that we have in the state as being the 3rd largest biomanufacturing region in the country. And I think that's really important. I also just want to mention that we just got back, me and a whole bunch of folks from Maryland and globally, from the largest bio convention in Boston this past week. So we were there as the Maryland Tech Council. We had several of our members there. The Maryland Department of Commerce had a contingency there. Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller was there for 3 full days, and I give her a lot of credit, understanding that the administration really does see this, as you mentioned, Andrew, as one of the industries that can help the growth of the state of Maryland continue to move forward in what we see as one of our really most important industries moving forward. And we'll talk a little bit about the bio convention because I think it's very important, but I'll intermingle that with our slides. So Christina, thank you very much. We can move on to the next. So this is the state of the state as to where we are right now with biopharma here in Maryland. We are the 3rd largest biopharma region, and by that we include the biohealth capital region, which is Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And in all honesty, DC is a very small player in that. Maryland is the largest state within the biohealth region, but as we're going to see in some upcoming slides, Virginia is making a huge push to be able to kind of take on a more major role in the country, in the US, as far as manufacturing, research, and development. But in our region, we have 52,000 life science workers, hugely important for revenues, for families. The life science worker, just so that you know, has a 94% higher annual wage, average outwise, than other private sector businesses. And I think that's really important. There are 3,300 companies that are within our region. And when I was at the Department of Commerce, we talked all the time about our assets and our resources. Obviously, NIH and FDA are major contributors to our region and to the state of Maryland specifically. But I will say all of the subsets of that, when you have the National Cancer Institute, you have Walter Reed, you have our educational system, Johns Hopkins and University of Maryland, the amount of research dollars that has come in the past and might be a little bit iffy going on into the future. But those are assets that we all like to be able to support, to be able to attract those businesses, right? So our job at the Maryland Tech Council is to be able to create the best ecosystem for life science companies. And by creating the best ecosystem for life science companies, it's everything from being able to make sure that there's a great business climate, to be able to make sure that there's great assets and resources, which includes the federal assets and the resources that we have, but also that we have a great living environment that's comparable or better than other states that are competing for the businesses that are looking to come here. And the businesses in which we represent, we have about 850 members at the Maryland Tech Council, and their ultimate goal is to be able to not only compete with other life science companies, but to be able to gather and explore opportunities for companionship and comparing of various types of assets and resources that they have internally. So the ecosystem is hugely important. And historically, Maryland has been on the top of people's list in order for them to be able to come to Maryland. We're going to look at some trends that are probably a little different than the trends that we've seen in the past. Christina, you can move on to the next. So some of the great industry investments that we've had in Maryland, and you can see them here. This is, I would say, within the past 18 months, and different types of announcements that have come out from some of our members and non-members, but people within the ecosystem. Obviously, hugely excited about AstraZeneca and their cell therapy manufacturing center, which is in the same area in which they have their main headquarters. They also have a facility in Frederick. MilliporeSigma, obviously the big news that came out a couple of months ago about their new biosafety testing facility in Rockville. I'll just say for MLK, we've been waiting for this investment to come to fruition in Maryland since a long time ago, let's just say, several years, looking for the Wexford organization. They're a company that invests in tech hubs, and their investment in the University of Maryland Biopark for MLK building is a wonderful addition to the ecosystem in the Baltimore community. And you'll see some of the others and the investments that they've had. 18,000 square feet at Lanza, which is in Frederick County, Maryland, and then also Biofactura, another manufacturing production facility, which ironically is also in Frederick, Maryland, which means that Frederick is on the map as the third largest ecosystem within the state of Maryland. Thanks, Christina. So what I foresee as trends and some challenges that we're facing in Maryland, and we'll go through a little bit of these, is the lack of growth, global competition, and we heard a lot about that from the previous presentation, as well as some of the policy challenges. Christina, next. So here is the nuts and bolts of where Maryland is. So Maryland being currently ranked as the third largest biopharma ecosystem. These are the actuals that we have to kind of live within, right? The national average, not dissimilar from other GDP actions that are happening in the state of Maryland. Maryland's growth. So this is not based on the existing resources and assets and businesses that we have here, but additional growth that we have is significantly lacking behind the national average. This was based on information that came in 2019. And I would say that if we were to do any sort of market research as to where we are exactly today, it would be lower. Maryland's growth based on the national average would be lower based on a couple of realities. Christine? So, and this is the competing states, basically, that's showing the amount of growth that they're having within their states since 2019. I will point out where Maryland is, and you saw the recent graph, you see where the national average is. Some of our competitive states are right at where the US average is, which is New Jersey, Pennsylvania. But those new and upcoming states, I'll take Massachusetts out of it because they are the #1 ecosystem for life sciences. But if you look at Virginia, with over a 50% growth since 2019, Delaware, North Carolina, at about a 45% growth since 2019, those are the states that are putting regulatory and policy initiatives at the forefront. Might I also say budgetary considerations at the forefront to be able to attract the growth of the bioscience industry within their own specific states. As an example, we work pretty closely with North Carolina. They do a lot of economic development, but they also do a lot of workforce development in North Carolina, and that is a big part of their push in order to be able to attract businesses. Maryland recently has done a workforce development push. Disclaimer, we have a program at the Department of Commerce called BioHub Maryland, and that workforce initiative is to be able to set aside any concerns that businesses have with growth in the specific states in which they're looking, to be able to make sure that they will have especially an entry level type of workforce to be able to come in hands-on, and I would say specifically that in the manufacturing community within biopharma. But Virginia has been, I would say, extremely bullish, right? They are all 100% out there. They created a lot of buzz about the billions of dollars that they were putting into a facility just south of Richmond. And they want that to be their center for life sciences, and offering a ton of different types of incentives and opportunities between workforce development and others to be able to attract those businesses to their state. Christina, next. So this is where the money's going. So this is as of April of 2025. On the left, you will see some of the major U.S. manufacturing investments that are coming out of some of the major global enterprises and where their funds are going. So this is tracking $158 billion of U.S. manufacturing investments, and Maryland has received 0 of these. And I want to point out, not to be controversial, but just factual, 8 of the 11 states with PDABs have received $0. And I want to give you just a teeny tiny bit more information on what that means. And I'm sure everybody on this call is very connected and understands where all the PDAB states are. But there are currently, I would say, 12 PDAB states that have PDAB boards. There are only 5 states that have PDABs that have the ability to set price caps or upper payment limits. And those states are Colorado, Maryland, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington. And so if you cross-reference that to the graph that you're looking at, you can see where the investments are going and where the investments are not going. And just an asterisk there as well, you'll see that Massachusetts has some funding coming to them, being a PDAB state. Massachusetts' ability to set pricing is only for Medicaid pricing. So I just wanted to make sure everybody understands that part of it. Some of the other states that do have PDABs within their state are receiving funding, but those are states also that don't have access to statutory opportunities to set upper price limits. Christina, we can move to the next. So there's additional challenges facing Maryland's ecosystem right now. The NIH budget cuts are huge, right? So we mentioned the resources, assets that we routinely and traditionally have talked about in Maryland being our higher educational system and our regional focus for training. It's being cut, whether it be Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, or some of the independent research laboratories. That's going to be a big challenge for us. We are seeing a big challenge. We have seen in the last couple of weeks, the university system, both the state system and Johns Hopkins, talking about pretty significant cuts happening internally within their academic resources. So that is going to be a challenge as we talk about growing life sciences, because the amount of research that's done there and the amount of companies that are actually coming out of those research laboratories to do any sort of additional research and investment and commercialization will be limited. You'll see the total number of job losses there. That's job losses for Maryland. That is an intellectual loss. Maryland, we've always been so proud to pronounce that we have the highest percentage of PhDs in Maryland based on per capita than any other state in the nation. The loss of intellect the brain drain, so to speak, is real. The FDA layoffs is also a very real risk for what we're facing in Maryland for the amount of employees that are going into the workforce at this point in time. We are seeing, obviously, we're seeing unemployment levels rise, but what we don't see at this level is the amount of underemployment. And this goes back to my Department of Labor days where we can talk about people having jobs, but they're not utilizing their full strength of their resume and their educational ability. We are hearing from industry leaders who are not hiring those PhDs at the level in which they could be employable in a different market, but they're bringing them in at maybe entry levels in order to get them employed and get them enrolled into a new company or a new system in the private sector. And I think that's dangerous because, well, I'll just input this here. At the Bio Conference in Boston, the number of global presence was pretty significant. And I would say the largest amount of global presence came from China, Saudi Arabia, Ireland, Canada, and a variety of other countries who are looking at the Maryland loss of talent as their ability to pick up on some of that science and technology strength that we have here to export it to their country. And that's kind of where we're seeing the absorption here is not viable to absorb all of that knowledge and intellect, but it is highly, I would say, marketable overseas. And I don't need to go into this because there was a major presentation just before me on the most favored nation status. But when we're looking at attracting companies, whether it be manufacturing, research, or development, being able to make sure that we have the types of research and development to be able to put back and to continue to fund research and development at the prices that we need to have, I think is it's significantly important for the U.S. constituent, for us that live here. And there's just an example here that talks about the Canadian model, and Canadians use the most favored nation as their model for drug pricing, and they only have access to about 11% of new cancer drugs, while the U.S. has closer to 90%. So I think that's a really significant data point to understand when we talk about what policy decisions and statutory requirements mean to the actual individual that's on the ground, utilizing our system. Thank you, Christina. So this is, I mentioned China earlier and the level of their presence at Bio. This is the first time I think that we've seen China really surge when it comes to the amount of research, and we talk about clinical drug trials. So for the first time ever, China has surpassed the US in clinical drug trials. There's a variety of reasons for that. I would say it's all based on regulatory and policy type of initiatives and claims that are coming from the US. And it means that they are really looking to be the dominant force in what we do as far as research and development in life sciences globally. And I think that you'll see the quote that we have there, but emerging biotech, they have a lot of choices that they can make. And, you know, as a former policy member or maker in the General Assembly, as a member of the governor's cabinet, what I can say is that we have to be very cognizant of what we're doing every single day, because it has a really important impact on business owners. And I would say life science companies are business owners, being able to make their decisions on where they are going to go. The significance about the difference in the drug trials is that there is now a sense of security going to China in order to be able to process these drug trials and go through that developmental process. And the more people become comfortable with going overseas and doing these trials globally, the more that they're not going to be able to choose the US as a place, and therefore Maryland, a place to be able to do business. Next, Christina. So the PDAP process and transparency, and I promise you, I'm not going to go through like everything that we have here. I will say just in my beginning statements that there are consequences to the actions that we take, and us as policymakers, us being a part of the stakeholder council, the PDAB in general, the decisions that we make have a direct impact on not only the companies that are here, but then also the patients who are going to be able to be served. And my focus is an economic development focus, which is to be able to say, we want the most companies here in Maryland because we want more access to the types of research, the types of drugs that are, and the types of treatments, quite frankly, that are becoming available to all of our Marylanders. And I think that is our number one point. But anything that you do in the public realm is going to impact the type of comfort that any type of business is going to have to want to participate in the Maryland process, the United States process, the global process. So making sure that that is at top of mind for all of the decisions that we make, understanding that the ultimate end goal is for the patient's use, for them to have transparency, for them to have access to the best treatments and the best therapeutics that we have, should always be our number one objective. And by doing that, we need to include the industry in those decisions so that the industry can help to be able to grow what it is that we're doing here on a continual basis so that it can be the cheaper, most effective option for all patients. Next, Christina. So some of the opportunities that we do have, I mentioned invest in talent. The BioHub Maryland model it's a great model. I'm very grateful that the state has provided some resources on a temporary basis for us to train that manufacturing workforce, because that is the gap that had been identified by the studies that had been done over the last couple of years. And that is easy access, easy entry, and great paying careers for people that want to get involved in life sciences. We need to continue to do that in a multitude of ways. A good policy for any industry is to avoid price controls, punitive taxes, and anti-innovation policies that discourage industry investment in Maryland. And I read that verbatim that's on this slide because I think that's a really important concept to have, right? I think we need to always keep in mind that people and companies and businesses are not in Maryland because they have to be in Maryland, that they don't have any other options. I've presented several other states and different global countries that have the ability to attract these same types of businesses that Maryland thinks that we have an advantage over because they have to be here because of the resources that we thought we would have forever. And we are not going to have them forever. And we're seeing this year more than any other time that movability and that exit strategy of what we're seeing some companies take on. We need to be able to win on cost. Here's the good thing. Maryland being the third largest pharmaceutical region in the country means that out of Boston and San Francisco, we're the cheapest of those three, right? So that's a real good pinpoint for us to focus on. But we also saw in the charts those states that are leading the charge in being able to attract investments from pharmaceutical companies and manufacturers are lower cost than the state of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and we're even seeing Ohio and Texas, right? So there's a lot of different states around the country that are becoming very competitive, who are, without a doubt, cheaper to do business in the state of Maryland. And so retain and attract. I'm a firm believer that right now, given the certain circumstances that we have in Maryland, I think that our focus should be on retaining those businesses that we have right now. I think that there's some risk involved with the movement of some of these businesses. I don't know if it's fortunately or unfortunately, but the cost of infrastructure for them to move anytime in the next couple of years is pretty high. But I think that we have to be cognizant of the fact that their future investments, whether or not they have facilities here in Maryland, I think their future investments of their existing facilities are at risk, given the certain climate of where we have. And we saw that with the tech tax that was passed this year, and the 3% tax. I think there's an instability in the amount of comfort level that some of these larger corporations think where they need to be and where they can have a little bit more of a stable business environment. So retention is definitely at the top of our list at this point in time, to make sure that we keep those businesses and those great partners and those employers for those jobs and those innovators here in the state of Maryland. Next, please. And that's it. So I told you I was going to be a lot shorter than the last one. I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. I've been watching this industry for my entire career, and I'm a full believer, as is the governor and the lieutenant governor, that this is one of the lighthouse industries that will help Maryland in our potential growth for the future. I just think that we have to be very cautious, and we have to look at a very balanced approach to be able to satisfy a patient's need, but also understanding the economic parts of this equation, which unfortunately Maryland has a little bit of a lag in at this point in time. Thank you, Andrew.
Great, thank you for the presentation. So we'll look for hands. Sean O'Brien, if you wanted to go first.
Sure. Thanks for your presentation. I just want to follow up on there was one slide you had, I guess it was sort of your critique of the PDAB process and transparency. And one of the things, one of your points in that was that drugs were selected in private and based on data that was not made available to the public. I wonder if you could say what data it is that you're talking about that wasn't made available to the public, that the manufacturers themselves would have permitted the PDAB to make public, because that's one of the challenges here, of course, is that a lot of the pricing information is characterized as a trade secret or something else that cannot be revealed to the public legally unless the owner of that data allows it to be made public. So I wonder if you could tell us what is the data that wasn't made public that you think should have been made public, that the PDAB could have made public?
Yeah, so I think that when we talk about overall transparency, Sean, and thank you for the question, I think when we talk about overall transparency, I think that we need to be cognizant of the fact that, yes, there are intellectual property and privacy concerns for the individual companies and corporations themselves. But I would say, you know, for risk of saying tit for tat here, right? I want to say that the selection process has not been really open in order for people to have a back and forth conversation. And I think maybe back and forth conversations would be really helpful in order for people to understand exactly what types of decisions are being made based on what type of data that they're looking at. I also think that there's a timeline that's involved with being able to provide corporate information to the PDAB that could be helpful in the decision-making process. But I think all of that, whether
Thank you.
whether it has been followed to the full extent of the regulatory process or not, I think what we have to be very cautious of is for there to be an understanding amongst all partners. And I consider the industry being one of the greatest partners to bring them in to be a part of the conversation, as opposed to setting them aside so that they're just receiving information when the rest of the public receives the information. Partnership in any sort of business development is the number one way in which to achieve your goals.
And I'll just jump in too. I think we want to keep this discussion more around state policies that can promote the development of the industry. So I mean, I think what I heard here is like PDABs may kind of as a concept be a drag to the industry and the state. I think that's fine. I think in terms of like specific feedback on processes and things like that, the stakeholder council will have future opportunities to kind of weigh in on those issues. So I don't think we necessarily need to use this forum for that right now. Any other comments or questions? I also had just a couple. Not seeing any. One thing I think we were trying to understand is if there are any, in terms of almost like importance or priority of policies that a state can implement, is there a way you would rank like specific policies that the state can try to implement to promote a robust biotech sector? I think your last slide kind of got to it, but if you had, if you had a magic wand, it could do one thing that would make us a competitive market. Do you have that kind of off the top of your head?
Oh, if I had a magic wand. I think some of the things that the administration is doing right now as far as policies, I believe is to be able to, and it's not even a policy so much as it is a message, right? So whatever industry that you're looking at, they need to understand that there is going to be a stable environment for them to move forward and to be able to excel, and for them to be a part of the successful relationship that's going to lead to growth. And I think continuing being able to address very specifically life sciences is hugely important. I think the underemployment numbers, I think, are significant to be able to retain the workforce and the intelligence that we have in the state of Maryland, to get them employed and to keep them here. Some of that could be tech transfer. There has been a lot of significant movements forward in the tech transfer community that's coming out of the federal labs and the academia labs. I think that's important because it keeps our Maryland-based intelligence, it keeps them here in Maryland and able to provide them with support. I think supporting the startups that are coming out of the university system and some of the larger research labs is also hugely important, because when you're born in Maryland, your company, you have a higher potential to be able to stay and expand and to do mergers and acquisitions with some of the larger companies, which is going to create that next generation of life sciences in the state. And of course, there's always the good business practices, right? Which I probably don't need to expand upon.
Sounds good. And then I'm looking for other questions. I had one other question, and this might not be, it might be more of a federal issue, but you flagged that one of the biggest risks to the US biotech sector is China. And that's one thing we're always just trying to think through and reconcile, because that's almost feels like a decidedly not market-based system. And I'm trying to think if there's any policies the US can implement to try to address these concerns. It might be maybe more investment or like onshoring of manufacturing, but these are just like, we're trying to reconcile like how China is one of the biggest challenges to the system. I'm not sure if there's anything Maryland can do. It might be more of a federal issue, but would be interesting in your thoughts.
Yeah. It might be a federal issue. And I will say that the state of Maryland traditionally doesn't have a huge capacity for clinical trials, just because we don't have the infrastructure for clinical trials. So other states do, obviously Boston, Minnesota, right? There's many other states that do a significant amount, Chicago, of clinical trials. And again, I think it goes back to regulatory practices that people can choose, because it is a global environment where they can go to a region of our globe that has minimal and more easy access and availability to patients than you would have in this country. And that's not a level of my expertise, but I think it all comes down to regulatory control. But I think not the good indicator, but I think an indicator to keep watching is that in China with the clinical trials, just because if they are making up some ground game in clinical trials, then is it manufacturing that they're going to overtake, right? It was a couple of decades ago that Ireland, who's a great partner of the Maryland Tech Council and the state of Maryland in general, because they're working with us on our curriculum to be able to develop a trained workforce in the manufacturing environment around biopharmaceuticals. They made a huge investment into their infrastructure in Ireland, and they are now one of the global leaders after 20 years to be able to just really focus on what their regulatory environment is and their dedication to promoting infrastructure in the country and their workforce development. And now they're one of those leaders in the globe that we can really say we have to be cognizant of that partnership with them so that Maryland doesn't continue to lose that type of global presence.
Great, thank you. All right, so any other questions for Ms. Schultz? And if not, I may also just check to see if there's any other questions with the last couple of minutes. It looks like Ben and Matt are also still on the line. So from either of the presentations, any final questions? I did see that Mr. Gutman put a question in the chat but also looks like be able to respond by writing. What percentage of the high-priced drugs have one or and multiple rare disease indications, so that we know what percentage of them could be exempt from drug price negotiations? So I think it sounds like that's for Matt or Ben. Do we know like what that rare disease exemption, what the impact could be? Feel free to jump in if not. If you're not available, that's fine too.
Yeah, our team has done looked at this in the context of the current exemption, the sort of sole orphan exemption, and sort of the implications of that on terms of Medicare spending. I think in that sort of cohort of drugs, there were about like 25 of the sort of top spending drugs in Medicare were sole orphans, and then 20 were multi-orphans. So we're talking about still a relatively small pool of drugs, but those drugs do represent a much larger share of Medicare spending. And that's of the drugs that like currently qualify for Medicare eligibility based on the sort of total spend threshold that's built into the law.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Gunn, we can also try to see if there's any research in that space. And then I see a lot of discussion around the NADAC. I'm not sure, looks like it's all been covered in the chat, but I'm not sure if we want to discuss NADAC at all. Otherwise, we'll check if there's any other final questions from any of the stakeholder council members for any of our speakers. All right, well, huge thanks to both the portal team and the Maryland Tech Council for providing such amazing speakers to us. These presentations will be available, or they are currently available online, and this recording will be posted. So do consider to continue to use this as a resource. Thanks again to Kelly Schultz, Matt Martin, and Ben Rome.
Thank you.
And I want to reiterate that thank you to all of you for your wonderful presentations. Moving on, Christina, would you please give us an update on an administrative update?
Thank you, Lorraine. I want to introduce 2 new PDASC members. We actually have 3 new members, but one was just appointed last week and he was unable to attend this meeting. So we will be introducing Dr. Gambrel at the August meeting. I want to introduce 2 new members. I'm going to have them just say hi and say a few words about themselves. First, we have Pallavi Arora. She's from the Maryland Hospital Association, and she's our new representative of hospitals appointed by the Senate President. Pallavi, are you still with us? Did you want to say hi?
I am here. Thanks, Christina. Hi, everyone. My name is Pallavi Arora. I'm the policy analyst with the Maryland Hospital Association, representing all our member hospitals here. Very glad to be here with all of you and look forward to working and learning from you all. I trained as a mental health practitioner, and I did that for a bunch of years before I decided to shift my focus to the policy space. So I completed my master's from Hopkins in health policy management, health policy and management, and now at the Maryland Hospital Association, I oversee the prescription drug, patient cost exposure, and child and maternal health and behavioral health portfolios. So very glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're very glad to have you and we look forward to working with you.
Likewise.
Next, we have Kathleen Logran. I may have pronounced that wrong. I'm sorry. And she's from Elevance Health. She's our representative of managed care organizations, and she was also appointed by the Senate President. Kathleen, are you still with us as well today?
Yes, I'm still here. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Kathleen Loughran with WellPoint, which is affiliated with Elevance Health, a national insurance company. WellPoint has had an MCO in the Maryland market since 1998. We actually came in and acquired Prudential Healthcare about 2 years after the inception of Health Choice. We also now have a product on the individual exchange market that we entered last year, January of 2024, and plan to continue to remain in that marketplace. I have been with Elevance Health for 21 years. Prior to that, I was Associate Commissioner of Policy and Health at the Maryland Insurance Administration and have been in the Maryland marketplace in one capacity or another for approximately 40 years now. So it's nice to be here. It's good to see everybody. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. We're very excited to have you. I'm now gonna turn it over to Andy. He wants to give us a quick update on the cost review study process.
Great, thanks, Christina. So we've posted versions of the dossiers for Farxiga and Jardiance, and we are asking for a 15-day comment period for the available materials. That would put the due date on July 3rd. So please feel free to review documents, provide comments. We did also ask on comment on whether or not the drug based on the dossier has created an affordability challenge for the state healthcare system or high out-of-pocket cost patients. So feel free to comment on that as well. And our next board meeting is on July 28th. We will be providing additional information on that meeting as it gets closer. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the co-chairs for their update.
All right, thank you, Andy, and thanks everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend today's meeting. Our next stakeholder council meeting is scheduled for August 25th, and we hope to see you at that meeting and hope you have a great rest of your summer. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any in opposition? Okay, hearing none, meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.